Welcome, everyone. I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear whispering in my ear, the Son of God discloses. And he walks with me, and he talks with me. He tells me I am his own, the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. I sing that song not only because it's the day after Easter, but because in a remarkable synchronicity, that song was the favorite song of the Methodist minister that kind of raised me up before I was 10 years old. And then when I was 30 years old, it was also the favorite hymn in English of my guru, Swami Prabhavananda. What an interesting synchronicity that was for me, particularly since I had been searching for another Pop Taylor when Swami Prabhavananda drew me to him. So that's my little story for singing that song, which is a very joyous song, as anyone who knows it understands. Is there anything else from anyone before we move on to read some more of Rabia? Rabia. I don't know if they do their R's that way, when she was pronouncing her name, but I like doing it. Anything else from anyone? All right, we read this poem last week, but I think we should read it again and start with it. So, Jeffrey, would you be so kind to read It Works?
Oh, I'd love to. It works. Would you come if someone called you by the wrong name? I wept because for years he did not enter my arms. Then one night I was told a secret. Perhaps the name you call God is not really his. Maybe it is just an alias. I thought about this and came up with a pet name for my beloved I never mentioned to others. All I can say is, it works. It works. Would you come if someone called you by the wrong name? I wept because for years he did not enter my arms. Then one night I was told a secret. Perhaps the name you call God is not really his. Maybe it is just an alias. I thought about this and came up with a pet name for my beloved I never mentioned to others. All I can say is, it works.
Rabia is just priceless.
I really like this poem because it's like if the beloved is truly your beloved, then it totally makes sense to have your own pet name.
Which I know you do.
I do, several.
Anybody else have a reaction to this poem? Thank you, Cindy.
Yeah, it also brings up if in our Vedanta tradition, God is in all of us, or we are all divine, then maybe the name is herself. Maybe the name is Rabia.
Wouldn't that be an interesting little turn of thought?
Mm-hmm.
Never occurred to me. What an interesting Well, she certainly would. She certainly would agree that she is the divine. She says it herself in
Mm-hmm.
more than one place. She has the divine characteristics of oh, omnipotence, for example.
I think Jillian's comment strikes even more when we read the first line. Would you come if someone called you by the wrong name? And if we just do a generic God, it's not the right name. So if we use a pet name which is unique and our own name, then we connect.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's right. None of the names of God are going to be anything but an alias, because
Mm-hmm.
God is nameless and formless. This is what we're told, and so that being the case, it behooves us to come up with our own pet name.
If you think about it, we're all that formless. I mean, we're in these people suits, but back before everybody had names, they probably started, naming children so they could have some way to call them and know who they were calling and know who was being called. And that's probably why we started giving the divine different names. So we'd have some way to call them.
There's an interesting chapter in a book called The Aquatic Ape, which is about the time it is said that human beings lived primarily in the water. Um, and it was that time when apparently we were transitioning back and forth from other forms of intelligent life, the cetaceans, dolphins, whales. This was a long time ago. And we learned to speak so that we could call to one another, according to this book, The Aquatic Ape. We learned to speak so that we could call to one another across distances when we were in the water. And I think, Cindy, that you're onto something when when the naming was of so that we could know what to call one another if we wanted one another's attention, particularly children.
Talking about names, it's just a funny aside. My full name, Swayam Prabha, is pretty uncommon even in India. So, not many people call me by the full name. In school, my friends called me Swayam. When I went to college, for some reason they called me Prabha. And when my nickname at home is Pattu, which means silk, and then when I came to America, that became shortened as Pat. So I've been called all these names. Now I'm back to Swayam here in Vedanta Center, but some other groups still call me Prabha. So I don't know what my name is.
Well, let us have a nickname for you. I'll tell you what it is later. Anything else from anyone?
Well, I really like at the bottom, it says, all I can say is, and then you have this line.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed this with the word is, and then there's this line which represents above where it says, I never mention it to others. To me, not mentioning something means silence. And I think the isness too. She doesn't tell us what it is. She doesn't tell us her pet name, but there's something to me that is, she says it was a secret. you know, the one night I was told a secret and she doesn't mention it. So there's something to me that's very silent about that.
Oh, yes.
And all I can say is, and then this line, you know, I think Ladinsky is very intentional, even with the punctuation and the breaks.
Oh, yes, indeed. E. Cummings would love you because he's the one who brought punctuation to the fore in the experimental poetry that he wrote in Paris in the early 20th century. He suddenly brought punctuation into as if it were words in a poem.
Yeah, I think it's something about stripping away all the labels, all the names, all the descriptions, all the interpretations, getting right to that root where there's something. It's here, it's undeniable, it's radiant, right? It's like it's undeniably radiantly here, but we could call it something, but whatever we call it would not be whatever this. I don't know. You know, I think I love these poems because to me they point me back to that mystery, right? But
Yes.
but we know it though. Like we're all aware right now that we're here. And
As you pointed out, Jeffrey, there's so many words in this poem that point to silence and secrecy, alias. You know, I was told a secret and so on. And I never mention it to others. And then that punctuation that, as you pointed out, really is instrumental in these last two lines. It signifies something. It signifies a real pause. Excuse me for the coughing and the droozle snoot, folks. The pollens have gotten to me here.
oh, no worries.
Thank you, dear. So anybody else have anything to say about this before we move on? All right. All right. Heidi, would you like to read this next poem? They might hold hands.
Yes, I will. Notice I didn't say Shirley this time.
Well, that just takes us into the old vaudeville routines.
I just had to rib you on that one a little.
Well, surely you wouldn't rib me.
Surely I wouldn't. They might hold hands. Maybe if I brought the moon a little closer, lovers would argue less. They might hold hands outside and point to the heavens and say, I think God is up to something sweet. They might hold hands. Maybe if I brought the moon a little closer, lovers would argue less. They might hold hands outside and point to the heavens and say, I think God is up to something sweet.
Oh, I love this poem, Shankara. I think it's a wonderful sort of admonition to bless a relationship with God and have God as like the Trinity, to have God in the relationship.
Lovely.
And you know, again, to Jeffrey's point about punctuation, the fact that sweet has its own stanza. I think God is up to something, and what he's up to is sweet, to sweeten their relationship.
Yeah, with an exclamation point.
With an exclamation point. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's lovely.
Yes, I do too. And, you know, it's given her assertion of omnipotence, you know, she she alludes to the fact that, having become realized, she is all three of the big O words. Maybe if I brought the moon a little closer, it's she's musing about what would happen if she actually did that. And it's interesting that the pivot point in this poem is the words "argue less." Maybe if I brought the moon a little closer, lovers would argue less.
So they still argue some, is what you're saying. They're still gonna argue some because it's human nature, but maybe just a little less if the moon, which I'm sure Ladinsky realizes represents feelings and the emotion, right? And the feminine.
The divine feminine, yes.
The divine feminine and our emotional lives.
Can someone think why the lines, they might hold hands outside and point to the heavens? This is what they would do instead of arguing. This is what seems to me to be the point.
Yeah, but, it's almost like you have this beautiful full moon, right? Like that in itself, miracle, right? Like look at this orb in the sky glowing. Like are they, but they're too busy arguing.
Right.
Their thoughts, their interpretations of what their lover said. Maybe if I just bring this miracle like right in front of your face, maybe oh, wait a minute, a moon, and we do this all the time. We're so busy. Like I know, I'll notice a beautiful full moon, and I live in a big city, Chicago. Everyone's so busy. They've got their briefcase and they're on their phones. It's like, guys, look at this beautiful moon tonight.
Yeah.
God is up to something sweet, and it's also sweet if you're looking in the right direction. It's like how much? You've got the sun, you've got the moon, you've got oceans and whales and giraffes and flowers and human. You've all this. Maybe if I just bring it a little closer, you'll get the miracle. You'll see. It's like how close. It's a moon, but it's not good enough. It needs to be a little bit closer because they're busy arguing. But when they're pointing, they go, "Oh, something sweet's going on here. Look at that." When you're more present, you notice those things. You appreciate those things. When we go on vacation, maybe like when we're away from our routines and sort of our rhythms, we notice things like that. That's why we feel relaxed on vacation. We notice the way people walk, what they're wearing, the music's in the air, smells. But in our day-to-day life, a lot of times we are mired in arguments and feeling tired and the weather's this or that, So I think I love this poem.
Yeah. Well, what you just said, Jeffrey, is one of the reasons to pay a little attention to astrology. Whether you believe in it or not, it draws your attention away. And like this current full moon is said to be a very powerful full moon. Now, as I say, whether you believe in it or not, it certainly does suddenly pull you away from all that briefcase and cell phone and all that stuff. As two of the spiritual teachers that raised me, so to speak, said, astrology is not determinative. It's like your psychic weather. And so it's, but it's interesting to, as you say, and it's like Rabia says, if I just got it a little closer, it got that much bigger, that God is up to something sweet. Rabia, the the possessor of God consciousness, the embodiment of God consciousness is up to something sweet, trying to get you to argue less.
Beautiful.
And I wonder too, Shankar, to your point about the word outside, I wonder if in Rabia's mind, she's imagining these lovers would argue kind of within their domestic domicile, whatever that is, right?
Yes,
Inside, we
right.
normally argue in the privacy of our own homes, right?
Right.
So she's saying if she can just take them outside where not only they see the moon, but it's taking them out of their domestic
They might
turmoil.
hold hands. They might hold hands outside.
Outside, right? Whereas inside, they're not.
They're doing a different kind of pointing.
Yes. Yeah.
That is not what I meant at all. That is not it at all. T.S.
So where's that from? J. Edgar Prufrock.
Yeah, it's
Prufrock?
now yes, it's from Prufrock. Yeah. Now I can't say the full title because you said it a little
I'm
mistaken.
sorry.
That's quite all right. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, is that right? Anyway, whoever that is. So.
And so speaking of full moons, you guys might know this, but Easter Sunday always falls on it's the Sunday after a full moon.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And so it just happened to be that the full moon this year was Saturday and Easter was the very next day.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always like that. It's
very, very rarely, yes.
A Sunday after a full moon. And so we were talking about this with some family members and wondered where the history of that came from. And I didn't do any research, but I just, our best guess was that it was probably some biblical reason in there.
Well,
I mean, I don't know. You maybe can.
The fortnight after the full moon is a time of transformation and resurrection. It's the dark fortnight of the moon.
Right, right.
And so it's the time of transformation and resurrection. And that's how it makes sense to me.
And isn't Passover also dictated by the phases of the moon? Might have been a carryover from the Jewish celebration of Passover?
I can't answer that. Jillian, I don't know the answer.
Yeah, because that changes, the date of Passover changes every year as well.
Oh, yes. Yeah, Pesach changes as well as
Right.
Easter, yeah. So, but I don't know about the lunar connection.
Yeah,
certainly the connection to the divine feminine is very much there. I mean, the divine feminine is the one responsible, according to not only the Vedic scriptures, but also in Kabbalah. The divine feminine is the one responsible for creation, preservation, and transformation and resurrection.
Brother, the other aspect I was thinking is there's a belief, and actually many couples and like families find it true that when there is this Amavasya where the moon doesn't appear at all, it's sort of hidden. There are like fights and people engage in all sorts of inauspicious things. Like the probability increases, and that's why they say that don't start anything new in the Amavasya phase or the period when the moon is hidden.
Yes. It's inauspicious, yes. Jillian, would you like to read The Way the Forest Shelters?
Sure. Oh, surely. Um, the way the forest shelters. I know about love the way the fields know about light, the way the forest shelters, the way an animal's divine raw desire seeks to unite with whatever might please its soul, without a single strange thought of remorse. There is a powerful delegation in us that lobbies every moment for contentment. How will you ever find peace unless you yield to love the way the gracious earth does to our hand's impulse? Wow. The way the forest shelters. I know about love the way the fields know about light, the way the forest shelters, the way an animal's divine raw desire seeks to unite with whatever might please its soul, without a single strange thought of remorse. There is a powerful delegation in us that lobbies every moment for contentment. How will you ever find peace unless you yield to love the way the gracious earth does to our hand's impulse? The first thing that comes to my mind in this one is kind of a non sequitur a little bit. This is like Mary Oliver.
Mm.
This combining spirit and God, you know, with nature this way.
Yes.
Is very much Mary Oliver. Not that Rabia knew her, but
Oh, but she well may know Rabia.
But she may well know Rabia, yes. Mm-hmm.
I love the opening quatrain. I know about love the way the fields know about light.
Mm-hmm.
Completely naturally, spontaneously, and powerfully. I mean, the fields become what they become because of the light. Without the light, nothing happens. So I just love that opening. I know about love the way the fields know about light. And many of the saints who write in this book have this same metaphor in one way or another. That the growing things, the fields, spontaneously. And then that's followed by the way the forest shelters. Again, completely natural. What Jeffrey was alluding to earlier. If we get away from the briefcases and the cell phones and we manage to marry our attention to something that is more auspicious. Does anyone disagree that there's a delegation within you that lobbies for contentment? Anyone else have anything else to say about this poem, please?
I guess unfortunately the delegation that lobbies for desires most of the time wins over the
Mm. Mhm.
delegation that lobbies for contentment.
Well, the lobbying for desire is the lobbying for contentment. We think we'll be contented if we achieve the object of our desire. But
Mhm.
of course, that contentment isn't really contentment. It's just a stilling for a very brief time of the restlessness of the mind. And so then we go right back to being restless. But there's still that yearning for contentment. So, what does she say is the single most important thing about this? Whatever might please its soul, that contentment, without a single strange thought of remorse.
Mm.
In other words, completely spontaneously, and without any looking to the side, backwards, or for that matter, forwards.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, to go back to the fields and the light, the idea of a field lobbying for light. You know, we lobby, we have strange thoughts. We want, you know, we negotiate, right? If I just have this, if I just can get that, once I get that new car, then I'll be happy. But not that car. I need a fuel efficient car, right? Then I'll be happy.
Right.
You know, you wouldn't think, oh, the field wouldn't be like, oh, I like north face light. I really didn't want to do south facing light, but I don't want to upset the north facing light. So, you know, they're not lobbying, they're not negotiating. It's so effortless, you know, and this love, this presence, this here-ness is exactly the same as that. You know, when we're not caught up in our strange thoughts of remorse, and we're just here, and it's just as easy as the forest sheltering. And, you know, I think it really points to what you were saying earlier, how natural it is. What's
Yeah.
unnatural is all the lobbying and all the crazy thoughts and the clinging and the grasping and just, oh, if I could just get my life to be a certain way, then I'll be happy. And then we get our life that way and it doesn't satisfy anymore. And then we have remorse about, you know, but this is
And I
not,
made all that effort and I went on to all that expense. Like you say, the remorse immediately sets in. I went to all that effort. I spent all that money.
right. And we do that with so many things, right? But it's,
Oh, yes.
but I just, it's such a beautiful image. These fields just completely open to this light in the most easy, effortless way. It's just so, and it's just like that. There's nothing we have to do. There's nothing we have to achieve for that to happen. They don't have to, it just is, you know, but
Right. There is no meritocracy in the sun.
Mhm.
yes, it's just, it's such a beautiful image for what I think this really feels like, right? Because it, you know, to point back to this knowing that we're here, you know, we don't have to try. We're not efforting to circulate our blood or
No.
not breathing or growing our hair, or, you know, we're just as natural as those fields, but
Ah,
we're just
ju-
as natural.
like you say, just as natural as the hand's impulse, the last two words of the poem.
Mhm. Mhm.
How will you ever find peace unless you yield to love the way the gracious earth does to our hand's impulse?
Mm.
What a beautiful finish to this poem. Anything else from anyone? Okay. Cindy, I think, has signed off. Swayam, would you like to read this next poem?
Of
My
course.
poem's attempt.
Yes, of course. My poem's attempt. All of what I would want my child to know, my poem's attempt. We are infants before each other, are we not? So vulnerable to each other's words and movements. A school I sat in cured me of hurting others. I have come to see that all are seated at his table and I have become his servant. Sometimes God is too shy to speak in public and he pinches me. That is my cue to fill in the blanks of your understanding the best I can. My poem's attempt. All of what I would want my child to know, my poem's attempt. We are infants before each other, are we not? So vulnerable to each other's words and movements. A school I sat in cured me of hurting others. I have come to see that all are seated at his table and I have become his servant. Sometimes God is too shy to speak in public and he pinches me. That is my cue to fill in the blanks of your understanding the best I can.
Again, this is one of Rabia's sermonettes.
Mm-hmm.
A school I sat in cured me of hurting others. Clearly, this points to her youth
Mm-hmm.
before she was set free. And then what's that followed with? I see that all are seated at his table.
I love those first two stanzas too, Shankara, that she talks about what she would want my child to know.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the next stanza, she says, but we are all children.
Mm-hmm.
We are all infants before each other, vulnerable to each other's words and movements.
And notice she doesn't use the word children again. She uses the word infants.
Mm-hmm.
Because infants are absolutely helpless.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every one of us can remember being shouted at when we were just tiny by someone who had lost their patience, lost their temper.
Mm-hmm.
And how it stung, how deeply it stung. So vulnerable we are to others' words and movements.
Mm-hmm.
Children read body language extremely well. It's a survival technique, characteristic. So yes, thank you, Jillian. Those two opening stanzas are powerful indeed.
I think too, with the vulnerability to each other's words and movements, can also be a hug or, the words "I love you." We're vulnerable in that way too. It's not just being scolded, but we're also very vulnerable. When we really open up to people and let them in, that there's a vulnerability with that too.
Beautifully said.
Mhm.
The only reason,
That's so interesting that we automatically, or a couple of us automatically saw that as a negative.
Oh,
well,
I did too initially. I was like, oh,
Mm.
then
well,
they're
I think
out, you know.
I think it's because it's followed by the lines. A school I sat in cured me of hurting others.
Mhm.
You know, I think that's why we make that connection. But Jeffrey went then on beyond. Yes, indeed, to what is we're also vulnerable and joyously so when we are open to, as he said, a hug or
Mm.
some words of endearment.
And to the previous poem, that vulnerability that was just mentioned, that second to the last stanza, how she says, how will you ever find peace unless you yield to love?
Yes,
Mhm.
I mean, then she says, the way the gracious earth does to our hands impulse, but still, you are vulnerable when you put yourself out there to be loved.
indeed. And you're very good at finding the through line, Heidi.
Mhm.
Very good at finding the through line. And I think we've all agreed that Ladinsky, there's very definitely a through line in his arrangement of these poems. He's developing certain ideas through the words of these people.
And I also love those first two stanzas, about the infants and all that. And what popped into my head when I read that, children and infants, but also animals,
Yes.
been an animal lover my whole life and had animals up until 8 months ago, first time in my life I haven't had a pet, but they're also very vulnerable,
Oh, very.
so.
There's
Brother
this.
Shank,
Yes, please, Swam.
I was going to say symbolically that the lines, a school I sat in cured me of hurting others. Could that mean a deep state of meditation that she got into?
Well, I'm sure that from what she says in her poems, that she did in fact pray, contemplate, and then meditate upon the the things that had occurred to her. And she says a teacher told her that until she could love everyone who'd ever hurt her, she was going to be stymied.
Mm.
And we'll find that in one of the later poems. Um, so absolutely, I'm sure that the school that she sat in, that's a nice way to read that she did this contemplation of the pain that she had been caused and the scars that she bore, both literally and figuratively, I suspect.
That's probably how she survived
Yes,
what she endured,
yes.
I would suspect.
That's how I read those lines about I wept for years when he didn't come into my arms. All those years when she was doing it by the numbers, so to speak, doing it by the way you're supposed to do it, calling on Allah in that way. And it didn't work. So therefore the tears. Anything else from anyone about this quite remarkable sermonette? All are seated at his table. In other words, again, no meritocracy. Everyone, as it says in the evening hymn we recite here, Love, who art partial to none, we
Mhm.
are equal before thy sight. So I have come to see that all are seated at his table, and I have become his servant, serving those who are at the table.
Mm.
And then she goes on to explain some of her service. Sometimes God is too shy to speak in public, so he pinches me. That is my cue to serve, to fill in the blanks of your understanding the best I can, which goes right back to the opening lines of the poem.
Mhm.
Anything else, dears? Okay. Jeffrey, could we ask you to read I Did Not Pray? If I
Sure.
did not pray.
If I did not pray, I could not move against this wind if I did not pray. And all that is said of me that is untrue would make lame my gait if I could not free myself from the weight of others' malice. I could not move against all his light if I did not pray. See how things become. What a change can happen when we find a way to keep him close. If I did not pray, I could not move against this wind if I did not pray. And all that is said of me that is untrue would make lame my gait if I could not free myself from the weight of others' malice. I could not move against all his light, if I did not pray. See how things become? What a change can happen when we find a way to keep him close.
Mm.
Yeah, for me, that last stanza, what a change can happen. It makes me think of even in the beginning when one of her earlier poems, she said, he kissed her, a kiss that did not go away.
The very first poem, yeah.
My very first poem, a way of keeping him close. When we can let go, when we can surrender, allows us to move in the light.
And that, as she says, that surrender happens in prayer.
For her, the surrender happens in prayer.
And of course, prayer, what is prayer? Prayer is turning within and addressing the divine within. That's prayer. I mean, it has its external aspects also, but I suspect that's not what she means. It's interesting to me that she addresses directly the opposition that we face in the world.
Mhm.
I could not move against this wind, which means it's a strong wind. It's a strong wind. And then she defines at least part of it. And all that is said of me that is untrue would make lame my gait. In other words, I couldn't move forward in a certainly not a dignified or elegant way if I could not free myself from the weight of others' malice. And then she says something that is a little puzzling. I could not move against all his light if I did not pray. Anyone have an idea what that means? I could not move against all his light if I did not pray.
Perhaps it's the powerfulness, like in the first, and I like how it comes down, the words sentences are longer and then they get, shorter like that.
Mhm.
But that's like, like a strong wind and all that. That's kind of like we were saying in the other poem. It's more negative, like the struggles in life. Whereas you think, you want to go towards the light, and maybe the light is just also so powerful, but in a positive way that it's just overwhelming.
That's how I have to think about it either.
If I didn't pray, I would just, like, I'd go around weeping all day long, I just, I couldn't get anything done. And that would be okay for a few days, but I'd have to pull myself together and
Well, there comes that stanza that Jeffrey pointed to right away. See how things become. What a change can happen when we find a way to keep him close.
Yes, I like your interpretation there, Heidi. That really feels right to me. And it's as if in that second stanza, God is not close. He's this kind of almighty, omnipotent, out there, almost fearful light. But once again, as she has in other poems, it's keeping him close and intimate. That is when we really find our way to him. It's not the big, powerful light so much.
I
as
like
our,
that. I like that, Jillian. Yes. Yes, all of these saints in one way or another tell us that it's all about relationship.
Mhm. Right. Yes, one can't have a relationship with this big, powerful light, but we can if we keep him, the personal him, close.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else from anyone before we move on? Okay, well, I think we have time to read this next poem, maybe discuss it a little, but it'll be what we start with next week. Oh, this is a wonderful poem about the camels. Heidi, would you like to read this one, please?
yeah, I like this one too. Trying to work in. Once I heard two camels talking. They were complaining about the weight they had to carry when they crossed the desert. And they were especially peeved about the new camel whose only load was the master's young daughter, who would often pet the camel and even sing to it sweet songs, while they had to often feel the whip of men and listen to them tell crude stories of romantic exploits. An older camel was overhearing the chat, as I was, and spoke, saying, it is our habit to bite when we are grouchy, and just yesterday I saw you snap at that man who whipped you. Maybe you shouldn't bite. Maybe the master has two daughters who sing and pet. And although this may be stretching things a bit, I am reminded of some words of wisdom I have been trying to work in somewhere for days. Those who are trusted by others, God trusts. Trying to work in. Once I heard two camels talking. They were complaining about all the weight they had to carry when they crossed the desert. And they were especially peeved about the new camel, whose only load was the master's young daughter, who would often pet the camel and even sing to it sweet songs, while they had to often feel the whip of men and listen to them tell crude stories of romantic exploits. An older camel was overhearing the chat, as I was, and spoke, saying, "You know, it is our habit to bite when we are grouchy. And just yesterday I saw you snap at that man who whipped you. Maybe you shouldn't bite. Maybe the master has two daughters who sing and pet. And although this may be stretching things a bit, I am reminded of some words of wisdom I have been trying to work in somewhere for days. Those who are trusted by others, God trusts." I love this poem.
Yes, I do too. Once again, it's Rabia's. It's her trying to fill in the blanks in our understanding, but also with this wonderful sense of humor that she has. Trying to fill in the blanks in our understanding. Maybe we shouldn't bite. Hard to remember that when we're grouchy.
Right.
Anyone else have anything to say about this one?
Well, I just found it just so delightful and humorous that, you know, she had this words of wisdom, just like on the tip of her tongue, if you will, and just waiting for the right moment to share it, you know, the right circumstances. This may be stretching things a bit. I'm reminded of some words of wisdom I have been trying to work in somewhere for days.
Right.
It's like the old adage, you get more, you get more with honey than you do vinegar, or however that phrase, that saying
Ah,
goes.
yes. Yes.
And I think it's interesting that she has, I agree with you, Heidi, but she has the old camel saying this. So the old camel is kind of her mouthpiece here.
Well,
Which I think is kind of funny.
I often wonder whether we should take these saints seriously when they talk about these conversations that they have and overhear among the animals. Because one of the things that is said about the realized is that they are able to communicate with other forms of life freely and openly. Certainly, St. Francis of Assisi was widely known for this. Meister Eckhart speaks of having a conversation with an ant. And here Rabia is talking about overhearing a conversation among three camels.
I mean, right there alone, once I heard two camels talking, you know?
Yeah, well, I think we might want to take her seriously, that these camels are not a metaphor,
Right.
that she literally heard them talking. And this wise old camel that had been trying to find a place to work this in for days was, but the way the poem ends this is where maybe we should start next week. You know, those who are trusted by others, God trusts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this goes to this idea that we are all seated at his table. We are all that divine presence. And so, you know, when Jesus said, I am the vine and ye are the branches, if you're trusted by the branches, then the vine trusts you, and even that which the vine is rooted in will trust you.
Mm.
Well, I have a slight, I've been looking at this poem here, and I'm looking at the poor camel being whipped.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, well, maybe the camel is justified in biting. Maybe it's not about the camel trusting, but it could be something. I mean, I'm just kind of scratching a little bit, but she talks about the whip of men and this whipping of the camel, right? There's, I feel a little bit for the camel
Well,
in this regard too. I was thinking about Heidi, how she loves animals. And I think, oh, well, here's this camel who, has to sit on this guy telling crude stories and whipping him. And
right.
Yeah. I mean, I'd have to look at it a little bit longer. There's a lot of text here, right? But I feel like she's getting at something. And I feel like I'm not.
Well,
would take me a little.
Let's take it up next week. But I think you're really getting to something, Jeffrey, because she points out, that the older camel said, this may be stretching things a bit. This may be stretching things a bit.
Because oftentimes we do look outside of ourselves. We do what our bosses tell us to do. We stay in line. We don't bite. We trust in a lot of times we put our trust in our light in other people, and I see it with my coworkers a lot. They just kind of do what they're told. They're kind of trusting that the boss knows best. He's the one with the whip. He's the one who's going to tell you how to do it. Make sure you do it right. And don't bite. Don't talk back. Right? I mean, it's kind of, at least how it works in public schools,
Well, it's the way it works everywhere, I think, Jeffrey. I think that's...
Yeah, so I think she's getting at something, I'm going to sit with it and I'm going to dissect it a little bit until our next time.
Good. One thing, because you've been so sensitive to punctuation, though this may be stretching things a bit, I am reminded there's no comma after a bit.
Hmm.
And although this may be stretching things a bit, I am reminded. So there's no break in that thought.
And I just realized that the quotation marks, the quotation ends at the very bottom. So the camel is saying that whole last stanza from,
Yes.
It is our habit down to, I've been trying to work in somewhere for days.
Right.
That's the camel talking. I think at some point I thought it was the poet took over.
Right.
She had a line she wanted to work in for days, but it was actually the camel.
That's what she says. And this is why I suggested that, it's worthwhile for us to look. Are these realized souls telling us the absolute truth when they say that they overheard a conversation among three camels?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if we've been talking about punctuation still, I'll look at this more for next week also, but I think there's 2 sentences in this whole poem, only 2.
Wow.
I mean, really long sentences. A lot of
Yeah.
commas, right?
Well, and I feel like from the right from the beginning,
It's a
she's saying,
long sentence.
once I heard two camels talking, like, so right away we're thinking, is she somebody that we can count on to tell us the truth? You know, so I think she's playing around quite a bit in this poem.
Yes. Well, let's call it an evening then.
Some good food for thought.
And so glad you all came. So glad that you were with us. And I guess Jillian has already signed off. She must have had something to do at the hour or half hour. So we'll just say, may you be safe. May you be healthy. May you be cheerful. May you have peace of mind. And may you go forward in the loving and protective embrace of the divine being as our mother and father. So, so glad to have seen all your sweet faces. And away we go, as Jackie Gleason used to say. And away we go.
Thank you
Good
so
night.
much,
Good
everyone.
night.
Good night.
Good night.